Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. It's the 21st of October, 2016. It's a kind of a rainy day here in the nation's capital, right? The autumn is coming. We're in the autumn. Winter is coming. And the election day now looms quite closely. So let's start with the presidential campaign, but in its international dimension, right? As you know, I've always argued the relative long-term primacy of international politics as a starting point. Of course, we try to honor both sides, domestic and international. But I'm urging you, as we have been now for some months, to look at the events around Mosul and the fate of the ISIS state, or this parody of a state, which they have created, right? This is ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, the Caliphate, Islamic State, you name it. It's all bad, and it's going to come to an end fairly soon, and the quicker the better. And that is the drama that's now going on in northern Iraq. And it's, I think it's a very important thing for the future of the region to have precisely the countries involved, above all Iraq, come forward and lead their own liberation. It's not their fault if the Saudi billionaires essentially bribed a whole bunch of officers back 2.5 years ago when ISIS came on the scene, and those officers ran away. We've seen that before, all kinds of examples. Don't need to go through them now. But the fact that the Iraqis are taking the lead, I think, is a great thing. In the course of the debate held between Mrs. Clinton and Trump this past week, the question of Mosul and the fate of ISIS came up. And I think it's positive now that at least this question was brought up. I think that Mrs. Clinton's answer on ISIS was inadequate, very unsatisfactory. I don't know what prevents her from saying ISIS is being destroyed, ISIS is being crushed and conquered and dismantled and shut down. Maybe she thinks there are people in the Democratic Party that are so blindly pacifistic that any kind of military action offends them. That may well be. And of course, then on the Trump side, his answer was also inadequate, because he said this operation to free Mosul is going much more slowly than anybody had thought or said. It's just not true. You can listen to all of the relevant commentators, right? Richard Engel, that very night on NBC, MSNBC, said the commanders are saying, and indeed now the Iraqi Prime Minister, Abadi, is saying that this is going faster than planned, not slower. So this inevitable element of defeatism and pessimism shows itself in this context as well as in so many others. So it's now a group of about 100,000 military people altogether, not all in the fighting spearheads, right? Not all, to be sure, in the tank spearheads that are going in, but logistics troops, intelligence troops, communications, all kinds of people. And hopefully it's going to be enough to prevent some of these terrorists from simply absconding with their weapons, right? At the very minimum, they would need to be totally disarmed. So we're now at the point where I think the leading edge of the Iraqi force coming from the south is about 10 kilometers from the edge of the city of Mosul, and we've had equally encouraging gains for the Kurdish Peshmerga forces coming from the east and the north. This place is now surrounded on three sides, and if you want to get out of there, you got to take the road that goes directly west towards Tal Afar. That's the area. So it will fall, believe me. Question is when. We want it now. We want it for November 1st. We want it in the first week of November. We want the television to be full of no more ISIS. ISIS is essentially a thing of the past, at least in Iraq, right? That they've been driven completely out of Iraq because of the close, the emotional element of the generated by the Iraq war, right? Ill-advised as that was. Now, the enemy, the terrorists are fighting back. And that is essentially a bunch of sleeper cells in the city of Kirkuk, maybe 100 miles to the southeast. Kirkuk, right in the middle of the oil fields, as I recall. There is an action by ISIS to take control of 3 or 4 police stations and hold them. And I'm sure those will be surrounded and those those pockets will be reduced. They will be gone within 24, 36, 48 hours, whatever it is. So it's essentially a propaganda element. And these are sleeper cells. More likely than a successful counterattack at this point is that ISIS will simply flee completely, that ISIS will say, this place is hopeless. We can't survive here. They've got 5, 6, maybe 8,000 at the most fighters in Mosul. The Iraqis are closing in. The Peshmerga have a solid front, and pretty soon the ring will be closed. And these people have to ask themselves, do you want to stay there? And then you face either being liquidated or surrendering, or don't you want to leave now? We'd like to see them leave now. And there's, again, uprisings going on inside villages, but also, according to many sources, there are now these mini uprisings in various neighborhoods, right? Small scale, but highly disruptive to the point of the, in terms of, the cohesion of of ISIS and also their political argument. Now, is the timing political? This is funny. Wolf Blitzer had Representative Kinzinger of Illinois, Republican on there. And Wolf asked him, do you think the timing of this is political? No, says Kinzinger. This is a long-term thing, right? We've been building up to this for months. It's very interesting because he's a partisan Republican. We've seen him before. He'd like to say, yes, this is terrible, but he can't because then the defeatism becomes too overwhelming, right? Do you support the troops? And this guy, of course, is a major in the reserve. So interesting dynamic there. There's also this question. This is the other thing that the Republican candidate brought up in the presidential debate this week, that should you announce in advance that these things are going to happen? And, of course, the Republican candidate, eager to find fault, says, oh, this is so stupid. They tell everybody, they telegraph what they're doing. They shouldn't do that. We had none other than General Petraeus. I think General Petraeus is looking around and hoping that he will land on his feet in the new Washington, right, starting next year. But General Petraeus, and we haven't forgotten who he is, we know who he is, but General Petraeus usefully pointed out from the military point of view that there are two kinds of surprise. There's strategic surprise, and then there's tactical surprise. In terms of strategic surprise, when you're putting together 80 to 100,000 troops, you can't keep that a secret. There is no way. Remember, ISIS has drones. They fly them, right? They know what's going on. So strategic deception, strategic surprise is out of the question, but tactical surprise, says Petraeus, is possible, and that is apparently what has been attained inside this operation. And we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. On a rainy afternoon here in Washington, D.C., 21st of October. Now, Petraeus, as I say, says, with a force of that size, 80,000 troops, you can't have strategic surprise. You may be able to attain local tactical surprise, and that's a very good thing. He says you want the civilians to know in general what's coming so that they can take steps to protect themselves. If they can flee, they should flee. If not, they should prepare some kind of an underground shelter or whatever it is. I'm adding some of my ideas here too. And you want to war the ISIS people. You want them to know that if they stay where they are, they're going to be finished, and therefore they should flee too. So you want them to know all that. You don't want to try to pocket them in there, because then what are you going to do, right? I've seen a lot of very facile stuff. They say, why are you letting them out of there alive? Well, what else are you going to do? Are you going to execute all of them? Are you going to have a mass liquidation of terrorists? That might be a tempting idea, but that's a war crime. You can't really do that, right? That would take us back to the Bush administration. So no, you can't do that. You can certainly disarm them and you can hold them, for a while. But then where are you going to hold them? You're going to put them in Guantanamo? It's not a good idea. So there are a number of considerations that are not so easy. I'm surprised, though, at the Republican candidate. The Republican candidate always cites General Patton, who was a talented subordinate commander in my book, and General Douglas MacArthur, who in my book is the best general of World War II on any side. And we could go on about MacArthur and his tremendous merits. We could do that. We could do this for a long time. But just take Patton, right, the lesser by far of the two. When you have the Normandy invasion, okay, 1943, 1944, you have a buildup, and then you're going to invade northern France, right? There's no way to hide what you're doing because you're having this huge buildup. But the questions then come down to where and when tactical surprise. So Patton himself was used, people should remember, as an element of tactical surprise by putting that fake Patton army, right? The cardboard cutouts of tanks and, inflatable balloons of artillery pieces and all that stuff, right? With the idea that the invasion was going to come in the Pas de Calais, the English Channel, right? The narrowest point. The Straits of Dover, okay? The narrowest point. And of course, it didn't. It came in Normandy. So there was tactical surprise in terms of where you were going to land. So that's the idea. So I think this comment from the Republican candidate was mal apropos, right? This was not a very judicious comment. Now, the defeatists, what are the defeatists saying? Well, the defeatists are not happy because it's going well. And the defeatists say, well, what are you going to do after this? In other words, what's the political solution? Well, I think the political solution is to reassert the sovereignty of Iraq and integrate these people, Sunnis or whatever they are, and anybody, into the political workings of the new Iraq. Why not? Right? Just because it was a bad idea in 2003 doesn't mean that you don't want them to succeed now. You want the opposite. I am always in favor of a regional economic development strategy, infrastructure, education, right? Infrastructure, public works, housing, universities, schools. The infrastructure, of course, is the full gamut from maglev and high-speed rail all the way to modern superhighways, modern telecommunications, and so forth. Ultimately, if you want to change the way these people think and live, well, then you better do that. And the way to do that is with massive capital investments, and those capital investments are just the ones you want to make for your own industries, right? Your own export industries. Let's also point out, though, I think we just have to say a few more words about this counterattack, right, in Kirkuk. There was a counterattack in Kirkuk today, right? And I don't think it's going to last long. It's a couple of hours old. The journalists all seem to be ready with their articles, right? Here's one from just after noon today, and this is in the National Public Radio. And we've heard a bunch of defeatism on the Diane Rehm show this morning. But the idea is Kirkuk, about 100 miles or a little bit more to the southeast of Mosul. ISIS fighters launched attacks on 3 or 4 police stations. They seem to have taken some over. Suicide bombers hit 4 stations. Gunmen killed some police officers. There's a curfew in Kirkuk. The fighting continues. ISIS has attacked an electric station outside the city. 13 workers died in the bombing. ISIS is claiming responsibility, and so forth. Right. So in these same articles, they have to concede, as I think we had yesterday on the other program, that the coalition, the Iraqis in effect, right, the Iraqi government has reached the town of Bartella, which is 15 kilometers or 9 miles from the city limits of Mosul. So there's also then the question of human shields. The ISIS people are trying to gather the inhabitants of the surrounding villages and force them into human shield position. So this is a desperate, dirty, genocidal, murderous strategy, just what you'd expect from these people. And I would say to anybody, you can't start whining about the inevitable friction, the inevitable losses, when you try to free a city from a force like ISIS, right? You have to, I think, realize that the misrule imposed by ISIS is precisely the worst possible alternative. So there we have it, and that's going on. It's going faster than thought, and it's not bungling to say it in advance. In many cases, you want to say it in advance. Now, let's switch over to the other things that came up in that debate, primarily between the two candidates. And we want to start with this question: do you pledge to honor the results of a democratic election? Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. We're talking here in Washington, D.C. Now, in terms of the final presidential debate, it is certainly important that there was more discussion about Mosul. Again, I think Hillary Clinton blew it on that point. I think that was the biggest, one of the biggest mistakes she made in that debate. We've also got to realize, though, that well, I guess we better cover the obvious issue, which obviously the big issue is, if you're a presidential candidate, is it your responsibility to pledge in a general way that that you're going to respect the results of an election? Put it first, right? The general proposition is, yes, I pledge to respect the results of an election. And what that, of course, means is that once every problem has been clarified using the legal avenues that we have, will you then accept the result? It doesn't mean, are you pledging not to proceed through judicial means to try to roll back vote fraud. And again, it's not voter fraud. There's no voter fraud of any consequence, right? 31 out of a billion. Are we crazy? But there is vote fraud. The vote fraud was practiced by the Supreme Court in 2000 in favor of Bush over Gore. This was the Scalia that so many reactionaries are still mourning. And then, of course, there was this question, and here we have the expertise of Robert Fitrakis, Ohio 2004. What's the story? Were the votes counted? Diebold, Diebold machines, right? What happened there? That's obviously very, very suspicious. And then there was what, for all the world, looks like an attempt in 2012, the so-called Orca machines of the Republican National Committee. And the question that it raised, many people looking at that somehow connected to the fact that Karl Rove would not concede the election because he was still convinced that there were uncounted votes that were still going to arrive, even when the Fox decision desk and Chris Stirewalt and the rest of them said, no, that's not true. So it's not that vote fraud doesn't exist. It's just that you're not going to find it at the level of individuals attempting to impersonate other individuals. That is by now, I think, an extremely marginal phenomenon, but it does exist. However, the problem is, are you going to make that an active element of your stump speech, right? You're going to keep saying that all through the campaign, that I reserve the right to contest this election if I'm not convinced that it's free and fair. I think that's also a misplaced emphasis. And anyway, it's not in your interest. I think any Republican would say that their ticket has not gained anything, and it has indeed lost grievously as a result of the constant stress on this point. We have all kinds of interesting anecdotes, right? Having lived through some of these. In 1976, it looks like Carter Mondale augmented their totals somehow or other. And Gerald Ford might have said something about it, but his wife, Betty, was sick and tired of living in the White House, and she had her alcoholism problem. And then she was somehow convinced, as the word went at the time, by Happy Rockefeller, the wife of the vice president, that Gerald Ford had done so much to restore faith in government after Watergate and to heal up the wounds, and that he'd essentially be undoing all of his own work if he didn't accept the coming of Jimmy Carter, right? We always hear this story about Chicago, the Daley Machine, and the Illinois vote in 1960. Did they vote for Nixon? Did they vote for Kennedy? I don't know. We'd have to see some proof on that. We also know that in the election of Jefferson and Burr and so forth, and Adams, that the situation there with Aaron Burr and Jefferson was touch and go, right? That was a contested election that went into the House of Representatives. And all we know is that Alexander Hamilton, saved the day. And here's a little article that we'll come back to and we'll say something about. Pat Buchanan, right? Him, the sort of the he might be called the John the Baptist in terms of what's going on today, but not in a good way. He goes back to the election of 1824, the time when Andrew Jackson came close but did not succeed in taking the presidency. So in 1824, General Andrew Jackson ran first in the popular and the electoral vote, but he did not get a majority, and that election also was thrown into the House of Representatives. And there, Speaker of the House Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams delivered the presidency to Adams. John Quincy Adams became president in 1824. Thank God. And Adams made Clay Secretary of State, which at that point was the popular way to become president since Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams did it, right? So that's how they got to be president. Now, we better thank our lucky stars that John Quincy Adams gave us 4 more years of economic development, progress, science, all kinds of benefits, and not the anti-state, anti-bank bungler Andrew Jackson, right? Certainly one of the worst, most negative people that we've ever had in the White House, right? And of course, the unlimited opportunism of people like the Sulzbergers. I'm sorry, not the Sulzbergers, but the Schlesingers. Sorry, the Harvard historian, right, who then joined Kennedy. There's so much opportunism in the Democratic Party around the Jefferson Memorial and the Jefferson-Jackson dinners. Both of these people are people you want to forget, not honor. The Jeff Jack, please, not. But anyway, this is where Pat Buchanan takes his stand, right? That Jackson was right, and Jackson was never right. Jackson was an absolute disaster, and the Democratic Party is to be roundly criticized for propping up this absurd myth of Andrew Jackson, who again was an absolute disaster for our country. You could say after the 2 terms of Andrew Jackson and then Van Buren, Panic of 1837, the United States was on a direct slide into civil war because of the decisions that they had made. And the main thing was to wreck economic development by shutting down the indispensable institution, the heritage of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay, which in this case was the second bank of the United States, which is not a bank in the way that the ignoramuses of today think of it. It's not a central bank. It was an absolutely indispensable thing at the time. And I've got a speech about that, I think, from the Left Forum this past May. You can find that, tarpley.net. So those are some examples of contested elections. Let's see what it might look like today. And we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So the Republican candidate says that he will not pledge to honor the outcome of a democratic election. And again, the way I understand that is this is not so much a question of, will you go to court if you think somebody has, floated a bunch of paper ballots down the Chicago River, which was the story way back when. It means after all legal avenues of appeal and correction have been exhausted, will you then, once the election has been certified, will you accept the result? And we can see that the Republican candidate, having made, I guess, the most colossal blunder of any politician in recent history, and who knows, going back how far, we'll explore that. But he's trying to make it sound like this is a joke. It's a joke. That it's ironic, right, when he says, I pledge to honor the result of the election provided that I win. Gosh, that is, I think, it's a shocking thing. Horrifying. Yes, she was right. It's horrifying. We're noticing Rush Limbaugh today, this Friday, still talking about the temper tantrum that he threw on Thursday in response to this statement, which I guess was on Wednesday evening. And that the claim from Limbaugh is that this was irony and this was a joke, and that it should not be taken seriously, and that everybody knows, according to Limbaugh, that the Republican candidate was actually joking. I'm afraid I don't know that, and we ought to talk about irony here. We'll branch out. We'll get back to the irony part of it in just a minute. But what's the historical precedent after this couple that we've just mentioned? I think the historical precedent that we ought to look at It's not so much what these candidates or what this candidate said about it, but what he actually did about it. And that is John C. Breckinridge. John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, I believe, was the vice president of the United States under James Buchanan. So this guy was representing the slave power conspiracy and the slaveholding interest in general, right? These are the terms used by William Seward of the nascent Republican Party. John C. Breckinridge was one of the four candidates for president in 1860. And you remember we had Breckinridge representing the Southern Democrats. He won just about all the Southern states. He won a couple of border states like Maryland and so forth. Breckinridge went on to become the Secretary of Defense, the War Secretary of the Confederate States of America. We'll follow him in a minute. But he was a Confederate general. That was Breckinridge. That's what he became. Then the other rival candidate in the Democratic Party was Stephen Douglas. Remember the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas, the little giant, all this stuff. He was the pro-union but also pro-slavery branch of the Democratic Party. So he won some support in northern states, but not very much. So you got Breckinridge, you've got Douglas. There's a third candidate called Bell, little recalled, but this is the Constitutional Union Party. They were mainly in the border states. I think he actually took Kentucky or one or two of these other places that were slave states, but not automatically going to go with the Confederacy, and they didn't. The fourth, of course, is Lincoln. So when you saw Breckinridge campaigning in 1860, right, quite apart from anything he said or didn't say, the idea was the Confederate mentality, or at that point the proto-Confederate mentality, was the South, the slaveholding power, traditionally controls the presidency. And that was their point of view. They said the presidency belongs to us. And it had. And you had people, Northerners, Northern politicians, Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. That's the Barbara Bush family, or Buchanan, right, from Pennsylvania, I think. Those guys were dough faces. They were of Northern origin, but their principles were to respect this idea that the slave states controlled the presidency. So when you looked at Breckinridge, right, and you saw Breckinridge on your ballot, assuming you did, the idea would be, if I want to avoid civil war and I'm willing to essentially give up on all morality and accept slavery, accept a national slave code, right, with more and more federal power brought into the fray on the side of slavery, then Breckinridge was your guy. And if you voted against Breckinridge, and in particular if you voted for Lincoln, the idea was that the blackmail of secession and possible civil war were right behind, right? We'll go and dig up some quotes to illustrate this, but this is unquestionably the case. You had to see it, right? In other words, if you don't vote for Breckinridge, and if you do vote for Lincoln especially, then you're saying that, in a way, you might be willing to fight, right? You might be willing to make some important sacrifices. So I don't know the precise technical details of whether Breckinridge ever conceded to Lincoln. I don't know. We'll look that up too. This custom, the tradition of conceding, is, I think, a more recent phenomenon. We'll look into it. But here's what I do know: that the ultimate concession by Breckinridge came somewhat later, and it came at a place called Bennett Place, or Bennett Farm. Durham, North Carolina is the local city. It's in Durham County, North Carolina. And here we have two Confederate generals, General Joseph E. Johnston And you have Breckinridge, who is the I guess outgoing Secretary of War for the Confederacy. So it's a negotiation then of Johnston commanding the army, his superior Breckinridge, the Secretary of War, negotiating with General Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman is there, and he's headed north. Right, he's going to join up with Grant, and if by this time Lee has surrendered. So this is a surrender which takes place after General Lee. Right, this is August 26th, 1865, and this is the largest surrender of Confederate forces in the Civil War, right? Because by the time Lee surrendered, his army had largely melted away. So this is 17 days after Appomattox. And it's Breckinridge, who, according to many accounts, Breckinridge is encouraging himself with big beakers of whiskey that are giving him a kind of transfigurational experience, right? And he's negotiating. He's getting more than he should have from Sherman, who was not well informed, right? During the chaos after the Lincoln assassination, he doesn't really know what to do. But I would say ultimately the concession that Breckinridge made was when he decided to surrender all these Confederate forces and just himself. Now, this is not a joke. In other words, the point of having a government, right? Look in the preamble, look elsewhere, is to solve disputes peacefully and to avoid hostilities and conflict. We wish to ignore them and to avoid them. And that's what we'll talk about in just a minute. Welcome back to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., October 21st, 2016. Now, problems on the horizon. If you've been listening to the American System, our program from Monday through Thursday, you will have noticed that we're taking note of a number of voices of people who are more on the activist side, political organizing side, right? In other words, people that you need, people we want to convince of certain basic programmatic, organizational, and so forth, other ideas, but engage in a dialogue. What a lot of them are saying is, look, with Obama, there was a general tendency that people did not dare to organize and with the idea of pushing him, right? Getting a little bit rough, right? Push. And of course, push is what you got to do. You got to be ready to start pushing back on November 9th. Actually, we're going to start pushing back right now today and see what we get. This is now a question of this war and peace, right? Because this I think is the obvious problem that emerges from Hillary Clinton's recent past. Is she an incurable warmonger, or is she a triangulator? And if so, what is she triangulating off of, so to speak? Crude, but that's the idea. In terms of domestic politics, she is a triangulator for sure. As a matter of fact, I thought of calling this part of the program, "What do you want? Do you want triangulation, or do you want something that looks more like autocracy, an authoritarian state?" And my argument is that it's better to have triangulation, because triangulation at least assumes that you're attentive to the political forces around you and you're trying to somehow put yourself right down the middle compared to those political forces. In other words, triangulation, properly understood, is an invitation to activists to become active, right? You call yourself an activist, so get active already, and do that. So, and then you can become one of the points of triangulation, or at least you can begin to pull by way of some complex vector sum. You can pull that triangulation point in the direction that you want. We ought to be aware. The news from the Electoral College map this week is that Texas might become a swing state. And this, of course, this is exactly the context of the collapse of the Republican Party, the extinction, in many ways, of the Republican Party. When we say extinction, it doesn't mean it won't be there. But what we're talking about is the idea that the Republican Party will lose its ability to sabotage the U.S. federal government, which is really all they have. And then using the sabotage, they can then extort concessions. So they say, we won't pass a budget. We'll extort concessions, right? You've got to give us austerity cuts on this and that program. We want the sequester to be honored, right? We want to cut spending. We want to shut the government down and try to extort concessions that way. Typical Republican stuff. The most serious has been the threat of default, to say, oh, it won't matter. We don't care about the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Doesn't matter. We have pointed out that no president should sit still for that. The 14th Amendment, God bless it, has that provision: the public debt of the United States lawfully incurred shall not be questioned. In other words, the president is imperatively commanded to pay the debt, and he better tell the Secretary of the Treasury, pay the debt, sell whatever bonds you have to sell. Don't wait for Congress. I'm sorry, the debt limit is not in the Constitution, but the imperative to pay the debt is. So the Republican Party uses government shutdowns, budget crises. They use this default, which really means national bankruptcy issue. And it includes, the wonderful John McCain. Isn't he wonderful? He is now promising that the Republican Party will indeed block anybody that Hillary Clinton wants to put on the Supreme Court. How about that? The sabotage of government. I don't understand how this should work, right? Government. The Republican Party is anti-government, but they want to be in the government. And the Republican Party motto is, government doesn't work, elect us and we'll prove it to you again and again and again. And what are we going to do for people who are willing to do that again and again and again, right? The white blue-collar worker is dissatisfied, yes, but you got to take some responsibility yourself for that. What have you done? How could you vote for such a monstrosity as the Republican Party? And I guess the answer is, well, they appeal to us through cultural populist motifs. No. So this is where we are now. And by the way, the Republican Party, why are they in crisis? As we've said, right, they're practically dissolving before our eyes this week. What were the three legs of the Republican stool, if you will? Was the religious element, in other words, the evangelical Christians, the fundamentalists, the Falwell, Gary Bauer, and related stuff, and all of that, and they had the evangelicals. Well, now you have a candidate who does not seem to live a life in the odor of sanctity, to put it mildly. Then there's the national security or neocon group. We've got the Republican Party hanging for its very life on the latest outcomes of WikiLeaks. And, national ticket that seems to be flirting with Moscow and Russia. I'm sure these people are very, very, very unhappy. And then the people who want their taxes cut, and these are wealthy people, right? This is the legions of greed, as we've called them. And they want deregulation, tax cuts, and union busting. There seems to be something for them, but they're numerically not enough, right? Even compared to the neocons, and above all compared to the big battalions who are the evangelicals, the Republican Party doesn't have enough there. So the Republican Party in big trouble. So the question now is, we want to be ready for the inevitable struggle to influence the direction of a Clinton presidency. Now, today in the Washington Post, we're told that the Blob is fighting back. The Blob. And the Blob, as you'll recall, is the foreign policy establishment, which is, I guess it's to some degree, it's bipartisan. So the idea here is that a group of think tanks are now working overtime to come up with their arguments for the post-Obama era. Now, one of the things this points to is the benefits of Obama, right? That Obama, especially in the second term, right, especially after Libya, which he has agreed was the way he did it was wrong, right? He says it was because he didn't plan for the post-Gaddafi. Well, the whole thing was wrong. It was bad, immoral, wrong, stupid, ill-advised, right? Reckless, irresponsible. So what they're thinking now is there is this mood of restlessness and the desire for war, which is infecting the think tanks, and we have to be aware of this, and we have to be ready to push back, and we will. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Here in Washington, D.C. Now, what we're talking about here is a report, in particular one from the Brookings Institution. This is the one which is perceived as centrist, but is not. This helpful article here in the Washington Post of today, Friday, October 21st, talks about the skepticism, and very healthy skepticism, of the Obama administration vis-a-vis these puffed up but really discredited experts, right? Because they're all people who, they were 1,000,000% for the Iraq war, right? Hardly any of them resisted that siren call. So inside the White House, senior administration officials, mirroring Obama's skepticism, have regularly dismissed calls for military force from the foreign policy establishment as the product of too much college and not enough knowledge, says Derek Chollet, C-H-O-L-L-E-T, a former top Obama administration official, in a book of his called The Long Game. And separate from that, other White House officials have derisively referred to the Washington foreign policy establishment and its experts as the Blob. Beware the Blob. The Blob is trying to engulf, phagocytate Hillary Clinton, so don't let them do it. There's a Brookings report that was a year in the making, and the head of this is this guy Martin Indyk. Remember him? He's really from Australia, but he thinks he can run the U.S. policy in the Middle East, I guess. These studies, according to the Washington Post, these studies are actually in sync with the stated views of Hillary Clinton. There's even a report from the Center for American Progress, which calls for stepped up military action to deter the Assad regime and Russian military forces in Syria. Now, Obama, for his part, has staunchly resisted any military action against the Assad regime. But Madeleine Albright, you'll remember her, right? You'll remember her views about whether economic sanctions that were causing tremendous mortality, morbidity among the Iraqi children. Remember that? And she said they were worth it. Madeleine Albright says, we do think there needs to be more American action, not ground troops, but some additional help in the military aspect. Watch out. Now this, especially Madeleine Albright, that might be somebody who Hillary Clinton might tend to agree with. Stephen Hadley, former national security advisor to Bush the Younger. He's a partner with Albright. Now, this is the Atlantic Council. We got the Brookings Institution and the Atlantic Council weighing in. And he says, strongly consider using standoff weapons like cruise missiles to neutralize the Assad Air Force so that he cannot fly. Wait a minute. And then we've got look, I think the reality. An unnamed senior administration official involved in Middle East policy, who was granted anonymity by the paper here to discuss the internal White House deliberations. I think this might be that guy Malley. All right, remember him? You saw him in the background of one of the recent Syria talks with Kerry. So this guy says, quote, you can't pretend that you can go to war against Assad and not go to war against the Russians. Yes, exactly. That is bedrock reality. There is no way you can attack the Assad forces because they are now mingled, intermixed, inextricably, all mixed up with Russia. So are we nuts? Are we stark raving mad? Well, the bet is that that Hillary Clinton's mental health is better than the alternative. So is she going to follow the siren song of the Blob? And by the way, these people will abandon her. They'll abandon any president. They'll say, go for military action. And then once the inevitable problems begin, they'll say, no, that's not what we wanted. You did it wrong, and so forth. So this is now the kind of thing we've got to be ready to do. But it means taking the path of activism and indeed informed activism. So what is the alternative here? It can't be this sort of pacifistic maximalism, sloganeering, right? I mean, no more war, no blood for oil, right? Money for jobs and not for war. Yeah, of course, that is the idea, but that you got to somehow find a way to do this. So there we go with the question of war and peace, right? This is going to be one of the early fights. Now, let's explore now the other side of this question, right? What Rush Limbaugh was saying today, right? He says, "Oh, those people at the Al Smith dinner of the New York Archdiocese, right? The Cardinal of New York, Dolan, was sitting between Hillary and Trump, and Limbaugh is not happy because he says that the entire media are taking this so literally. They're so uptight. They're so rigid. They don't have a sense of humor." The Washington Post is Trump's refusal to honor the outcome of the election swells GOP angst. Angst, of course, the German word for fear. And yes, private fears of a looming landslide. Party continues a scramble to save down ballot seats. A wave of apprehension and anguish swept the Republican Party on Thursday, with many GOP leaders alarmed by their candidate's refusal to accept the outcome of the election and concluding that it is probably too late to salvage his flailing presidential campaign, writes the Washington Post, right? So it's all rigged, and it might even be stolen, which is worse. Now, we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio with a discussion of irony and humor. radio. So we've looked at the policy side of that, honoring the vote or not. But is this all a joke? Is it irony? Now, we want to talk about irony. My point of view has always been that irony is one of the essential components of humor, of good wit, and the cultivation of irony. The lack of it, I think, is one of the symptoms of a cultural decline, right? A cultural deterioration that we're living through. So let's see what is the result. Limbaugh says those networks that are freaking out, right? The big media, he says, if Trump says if I win, he doesn't really mean that. He means that he's going to honor, obviously, says Limbaugh, the obvious thing. It's all a joke. It's all a joke. And in the debate, right? Will you honor the outcome of the election? I'll tell you when it happens, or I'll wait for that to happen, and then I'll tell you. Well, I mean, as a practical matter, and this is the least of it, although it's quite important. Why let this issue grow, right? Why not avoid this whole thing to begin with, right? What necessity is there to delve into this issue about whether you're going to honor the outcome of the election, right? It is an extremely important point when you think, though, that it's the Constitution you're talking about. In other words, what you're being asked is there's a process for electing the president which is largely specified in the Constitution, especially the part about the Electoral College, and then there's a massive statute law about that. Then there are traditions and customs, which also have some weight. And are you going to honor all that? And why not simply avoid bringing that up? Why make that an issue? And it is, of course, the Republican ticket which has made it an issue, right? And it's now commonplace to say this is because the Republican candidate fears defeat and is trying to build essentially an alibi, right? Why did you lose? Well, because it was not fair. Limbaugh keeps repeating that the people attending the Al Smith dinner, and again, a lot of them are Republicans, right? He calls them elitists. That's a separate discussion. What is an elitist these days? But they're so uptight. They're hysterical. What are they? Are they afraid of something? Is there something implied by what the Republican candidate is saying that makes them frightened? Limbaugh thinks that what's being telegraphed is, I'm not the usual Republican. I won't just cave and roll over. I'm going to fight back. Okay, fine. But this would be my thesis. If you're arguing that the Republican candidate has a sense of humor, I think that this contention is undermined by behavior during the Al Smith dinner. In other words, if you're saying the stuff about honoring the election automatically yes or no, if that's supposed to be a joke, if that's supposed to be an elaborate ruse, farce, I don't know what, then where is the sense of humor? Now, if we look at this Al Smith dinner, this is supposed to be the great arena of self-deprecating humor, which is hard to find these days. And the Republican candidate even referred to the fact that the expectation was that the candidates are supposed to make fun of themselves. And he said some people think that might be hard for him to carry out. He obviously had a text, right? He has some writers, but this is a tradition. I think it goes back to Quintilian, the Roman writer on rhetoric. But this is what's known as the captatio benevolentiae. Captatio benevolentiae. In other words, seizing or eliciting goodwill, benevolence, right, from your audience. And it is traditionally a rhetorical technique where you capture the goodwill of the audience by, at the beginning of your speech, telling a joke at your own expense, right? So obviously Quintilian based it on Cicero, right? So Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, right? Big oligarchical activist at the end of the Roman Republic, right? Cicero said, this is one of the things you have to do. One of the pillars of oratory is the captatio benevolentiae, right? You're winning goodwill by making fun of yourself a little bit. People relax, and they're better oriented towards you. I would submit, if you look at the two candidates' performance in the Al Smith dinner, you would say that Mrs. Clinton and her writers, right, because that's obviously who it is, that they were generally able to make their political points without violating this self-deprecating thing. But that the Republican candidate in particular, I think there were two or 3 points where he showed that he was not the master of this technique. When he said that Hillary Clinton is so corrupt. Now, this is not self-deprecating. In other words, if you're going to do this, the way you do it is not to say it directly out loud, but you create a situation where this is implied and the audience gets to it, so to speak, on their own, and then you draw some humorous consequence from that. Another one, this question, you hate Catholics. And this was supposedly based then on stuff that has appeared in WikiLeaks. And those were greeted with hoots and jeering and so forth. So somehow it was not a very good recompense to the Archdiocese of New York and Cardinal Dolan to go to their charity, right? There's a charity for children who are supposed to be in the foreground, and then make these blunt remarks, right? You're corrupt. You hate Catholics. This is, I think, this is the opposite of irony. Now, remember, with irony, the reason irony is so important is that it presupposes that people know what reality is. In other words, irony, I think one way to put it is there's a surface meaning to the words, right? There's one thing that they seem to be saying in terms of, expository prose, right? A statement of fact. But in reality, there are clues inside the statement, among the words. There are some clues or tone or something going on, which signals to you that the surface meaning is not the intended meaning. And some of the best examples of irony are when the actual meaning, the intended meaning, is practically the opposite of what the surface meaning seems to be. It's like saying politician X is a great person and he or she is so wonderful, and you go on like this for a while, and at a certain point it begins to dawn on the listener, well, wait a minute, this is not really saying the surface meaning, it's saying something else, and perhaps even the opposite. So I'm all for humor. I think in English especially, the puns are important, right? You look at Shakespeare. Punning is one of the main elements of Shakespeare, and irony. And I think that this irony has been lost track of. But I would say the threat to not recognize the election is not funny, and we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, our last segment already. Remember to keep in touch an extra 4 days a week, not just this program, but Monday through Thursday. Go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. That is the American system of Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, Justin Morrill, and then the populists, the New Deal, and JFK. That's the American system. A couple of more things on irony. historical irony is observed sort of at a greater distance, but the historical irony would say, look, an attempt to revive the Republican Party is leading to its demise. That would be an irony, a historical irony. Sarcasm, not the same thing, right? Sarcasm doesn't necessarily has these elements, right? Sarcasm is just a kind of strong industrial strength, robust kind of ridicule. So what we're left with now is the choice between a kind of authoritarianism and a form of triangulation. And as I say, activism will be necessary no matter what happens. We have to watch out. It's getting to be the last 10 days of October, right? Halloween now 10 days away. So we've got to be ready for anything, right? We got to be ready for outside events. It is assumed that by the time of the election, about 40% of people will have voted. Today happens to be, 21st of October, is your last day to vote in Virginia. The federal judge added a day or two. And Florida, you're getting down to the last days to register. And similarly in other states. And our motto here is, from the 1950s, register, inform yourself. That's where we come in. Subscribe, be a part of it. Listen to this program and the American system, and then vote, and vote early. Vote early. Don't wait around, right? You don't know what's going to happen. So vote. Now, the other thing, this stuff with WikiLeaks, right? This, I think, is it's just wrong, and we ought to say something about it. Let's see how much we can do. Before we get to that, though, there is almost no voter fraud. If there are 31 cases per billion, this is not a public policy issue. Forget voter fraud. Rather, the reality is voter suppression. Voter suppression is at work right now in Texas, right? It would probably be a much easier proposition to turn Texas into a swing state and transform the entire U.S. political system. Think of it. If we didn't have some of these fake voter suppression things that go on. At the same time, beware of complacency. Beware of the notion that this election has been decided in the sense of finished. It has not been. The handwriting is on the wall. The tendency is clear. If all else remains, right, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, we can see where it's going. But complacency could overrule this. Up to now, the election has been a match between the enthusiasm of some on the Republican side, we're putting it mildly, and the fear, in particular the fear on the Democratic side. Not so much enthusiasm on the Democratic side, but the fear. If the fear begins to depart, then the result might change. So I urge people not to let that happen. And in the meantime, let us contemplate this WikiLeaks. Look, I am astounded that these news organizations can essentially now organize their day around the latest dump coming from Assange, ensconced in the Ecuadorian embassy. And this organization that he has, who knows who is sending that stuff in? They say, well, that's WikiLeaks. How do you know that? How do you know it's not the XYZ intelligence agency of Fredonia, right? The Fredonian intelligence is on the mark. I don't accept, and I will not accept that this is Russian government until some proof is given, right? We learned the lesson of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or we didn't, and we have here. I have. So I don't accept this without proof. And again, I think it's politically not smart to try to mix these up. Trump is one thing. Russia has been around for a long time and will be around, and it's better to keep these separate. And I think it's a terrible opportunism to try to mix this up, as the Democratic Party once again is doing. But anyway, WikiLeaks, right? Remember that Wiki World, Brave New Wiki World, was the title of an article by Cass Sunstein in the Washington Post. This was the debut of WikiLeaks in the middle 2000s, and was presented then as an organization that was going to give China a hard time. But let's just go through and tick off the points. The leader of the operation, and this generally goes for the Pentagon Papers and Ellsberg. It goes for Assange, whose computer has been cut off by the Ecuadorian government, and also by Snowden. They are the beneficiaries of a Damascus Road conversion, whereby they go from being completely on the other side to being on the leaking, the whistleblower, document dump side of things, with very little preparation and very, very suspicious. There are other whistleblowers with more dramatic documents who are ignored by the same media. And instead, when the approved limited hangout operator comes forward, a media cartel mobilizes just about immediately, right? The Washington Post, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, blah, 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 back in the time of the Pentagon Papers, this international press cartel that went and published the Assange stuff, and similarly for Sunstein, although Sunstein has a more closely hold, I'm sorry, not Sunstein, but what's his name here now? Snowden. Snowden has a more closely controlled media cartel. These papers tell you, first of all, nothing big. They don't tell you anything about Watergate or the Kennedy assassination or 9/11 or any of these more recent things, right? The secrets that, for example, might have been in the Sunstein. I keep saying Sunstein in the Snowden documents. Right? There's nothing big. There's nothing about the great covert operations of the age or other, huge topics. There's also nothing or very little new. In general, the operations exposed by Snowden in particular were known. They'd been in the New York Times, and what we found out about them was essentially a bunch of code names, which are very useful, but which do not add up to an earth-shattering revelation. So, Damascus Road, the others are ignored. The media cartel that somehow pops into existence, right? And this is not how the ruling class operates. When they don't want it to be publicized, they make sure it is not publicized. If a media cartel emerges, it means that the establishment wants it to be ventilated. Nothing big, nothing new. The protagonist often goes on to a great career, right? Morton Halperin and Leslie Gelb, who were generally, associated with the Pentagon Papers. They go on to a wonderful career. Halperin even founds a dynasty, I guess we'd say. They're not ostracized, they're rewarded. And the document dump prepares new covert operations. Best example, the Pentagon Papers prepare the plumbers in the Watergate scandal. Assange prepares, with his papers, the Arab Spring. And Snowden, I guess, prepares a phase of bad relations between U.S. and Russia. So you see, don't believe WikiLeaks, right? This is not a reliable source. People in the New York Times should stop organizing a day around WikiLeaks. And we'll see you again next week here on World Crisis Radio, and in the meantime on The American System.